She's gonna sing, you're gonna listen.
1, 2, 3, 4. Margaret, back in junior high, Margaret, all yellow curled. She was the most popular girl. Margaret, she was beautiful. Margaret developed first. We all thought she had all the luck in the world. She never noticed me. What could I give her? I knew someday I would have to forgive her. Ooh, Margaret, dear Margaret, do-do-do, do-do-do-da-da-da-da, such a lucky girl, do-do-do, do-do-do-da-da-da-da, I say Mary's girl, do-do-do-da-da-da-da, such a lucky girl, do-do-do-da-da-da-da, how could I ever forget Margaret?
This is Infants on Thrones. Philosophies of men mingled with humor. We are the core.
Welcome back to Infants on Thrones. I'm Glenn Ostland, and today we're talking with the articulate, intelligent, incredibly thoughtful Margaret Toscano in what I think is probably one of the most insightful discussions that we've ever had on Infants on Thrones, mainly because it was mostly Margaret speaking. And now, if you haven't heard Margaret Toscano, then stop what you're doing and Google her name, because it's certainly a name worth knowing. Now, we had some audio issues with the interview, but hopefully the editing has cleaned that up and smoothed that out enough that it isn't such a distraction. But there are times when Margaret's sound is a little choppy, and sometimes when Chelsea sounds a little bit like a cross between Stephen Hawking and an old Speak and Spell.
Very fascinating dynamic.
You win.
But like I said, it was a fascinating discussion, and as you'll quickly hear, it didn't take long for Margaret to turn the tables on Bob and I and start actually interviewing us. So sit back and enjoy this conversation about gender roles, activism, the Ordain Women movement, faith, spirituality, Heavenly Mother, Margaret's views on whether or not there should be a separate priesthood for women, and a bunch of other really interesting stuff. So take it away, Margaret.
So, Bob, where do you live?
I live in San Jose, California.
Okay, and what do you do?
Something very boring. I work in product management, so I work for a tech company and do marketing type stuff, product management. So I actually met you a long time ago, but it was just briefly as part of a Q&A, and it's
where was that?
That was at, I don't know that it was called Utah Valley University at the time, but I think it was UVSC at the time, but it was some sort of conference or get together on religion that the university was sponsoring.
Wow. Yeah, I've done a few things there.
I'm sure.
Was it the one where it was kind of a gender conference, or was it the Society of Mormon Philosophical Theology?
You know, I'm not sure because I only remember my impression and interaction with you, which was very gender focused. So, but I assume that that's kind of what you would probably talk about, independent of what the conference is about, because that's your area of expertise.
Yeah, I mean, in both of those contexts, I did talk about gender. I mean, I don't always, but obviously it's kind of one thing I'm very passionate about.
Right. I remember because I was a young, return missionary, newly married, and I don't know who invited me, but I was so interested, but at the same time, you sort of scared me.
Yeah.
I don't know if Chelsea's back yet, but she would laugh at that because I'm not at all scary, really.
No, and I've gathered that over the years because I've in the most non-creepy way possible, I want to say I've followed you and admired you for like over a decade now, but I've never actually...
That makes me feel so good. I'm glad to have admirers.
Well, good.
It's really funny because being an excommunicated Mormon, you can often feel very rejected and also misjudged, that people are going to, they make all sorts of assumptions about you.
Yeah, and I was probably part of that. I think my assumptions about you kept falling apart or going away as the years went on, and I had my own doubts, and I realized that I was doing a disservice by assuming things, and, I had my own issues. So I think the first time I met you, I was very much a stereotype that I wish I wasn't.
But, we all make false assumptions. I think liberal Mormons, progressive Mormons often do the same thing with more mainstream people. And everybody's more nuanced than, the stereotypes. So, Glenn, I don't think I asked you where you live.
I live in Bloomington, Indiana. So I came out. I think you must know who Bert Wilson was.
I do.
Yeah. So I was a student of Bert's at
I even met him a few times. I never really knew him.
Okay, yeah. I know you've got an interest in myth and paths must have crossed a few times. So I studied folklore under Bert at BYU, and then I came out to Indiana University and got a master's degree, and then ABD. My dissertation was Mormon humor. I was focusing on Mormon stuff, but it kind of fell apart for me, and I got offered a job at a medical device company that's local here, but it's a global company. So I've been working for that company for the past 10 and a half years. But that's how I got out here. But I grew up in Arizona, and my grandmother was a Merrill and from Safford, and goes back to I think Philemon is probably our closest connection, because I'm through Serena.
Since we're two different wives.
Yeah, his first wife, and you were I think Mary Jane, was it?
Mary Jane, right. Yeah, Mary Jane's mother was Hannah Ann Du Bois, and she's actually one of the potential wives of Joseph Smith. If you look at suddenly my friend's book on the sacred loneliness, Todd
Compton. Yeah,
Todd is an old friend of mine. At any rate, she's listed as one of the possible wives of Joseph Smith, Mary Jane's mother. So there are a lot of interesting connections there. My father was born in St. David, Arizona. Have you ever been there, Glenn?
I may have driven through it.
Because it's very close to Safford.
Okay.
It's I don't even know if it's still. It was a small town when I was a little girl, and we used to go there for family reunions.
Yeah.
But it was set up by Mormons, and my father, they went to Safford all the time.
Yeah.
That was kind of where they would go for their, their stake conference. Spencer Kimball was my father's stake president when he was young.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, these Mormon connections are always...
It's interesting, yeah.
You start talking and everybody gets connected.
Yeah, my sister was talking with her husband shortly after they got married and realized that they were third cousins or something, going back in this thing, and they went, no! It's too late. They figured it out too late.
Third.
Yeah.
Believe me, if I knew she was my cousin, we never would have dated.
That's terrible.
You back, Chelsea?
Yes, I am. Sorry about that.
No problem. We were swapping the Mormon connections.
Yeah.
And I was asking Glenn and Bob where they live. And I think it's interesting, Glenn and Bob, that you both talk about sort of having the boring jobs.
I don't remember saying they were boring. Do you, Bob?
But sometimes I think that there's something good about that. I mean, if you have a job that, pays the bills, but doesn't, demand, writing or something, you have more time to spend on your passions, right? Whereas with Chelsea and I, if you're in academia, I have so many different intellectual demands on my time. And, it's like I have too many areas that I want to write out. I say right now that I have like 8 books I still want to write.
Margaret, we were just talking about that at this point, I'd rather get like a job that pays a lot of money and I'll just hire a couple editors to finish my stuff for me. So I think I'd be more productive.
It's really hard. I mean, because not only do I have all my teaching, which is very demanding, but I'm the director of graduate studies and I have so many committees I have to be on. And I am, not only do I do Mormon studies, but I also do classics and
So Bob was talking about the first time that he met you, and I think that's kind of relevant to why we wanted to have a conversation with you in the first place. You know, Bob said something recently that when he thought about influential feminist in his life, he thinks Margaret Toscano, because you blew his mind at a time in his life when he didn't even know that his mind was being blown. And I loved the way that you said that. And so I'm really curious at what those things were for you, Bob, and is that something that we could structure a conversation around?
Oh, sure. If I don't know if it's as interesting as I set it up to be, but
it was kind of a superlative, mind blowing.
Yeah. So at this conference, Margaret, that I met you at, I was just sitting there in the back listening, but I was actually quite frustrated with you.
That's
because
okay.
I'm a good Mormon boy. I mean, you were kind of like, kicking against the pricks. You were doing your thing, and you were challenging assumptions and talking about Heavenly Mother, and I was just like a newly returned missionary, and well, actually at that point I was married, but still, that's only like, it was a year or two after my mission. But I was a little frustrated, and I decided to ask you a question. So I in the Q&A portion, I raised my hand and I said something like, to the effect of, as I remember it anyway, like, well, what do you want us to do? What do you expect? And you had this look of like, it was kind of pain and patience at the same time, because you were you were actually really nice. You answered my question without just blowing me off, which I still remember to this day. So you basically said, if you're really asking me sincerely, what I want you to do is go home and the next time you read the Book of Mormon, sub out every pronoun for God and make it a she instead of a he, and just see how it makes you feel and see what the experience is like. And I took you up on it. I did it, and this is like way back in, I don't remember, 2003, 2004. And I didn't like it. It made me uncomfortable. Then I sort of
it was probably not me, but that is mind blowing when you suddenly realize the dominance of the male voice and the absence of women and of anything to do with the female in these texts. I mean, it's missing.
Yeah,
it really is. I remember thinking in my head at one point, I'm like, whenever there's a female mentioned, well, I'm going to use a male, so there. But then, it never happens, so it doesn't really matter.
So Abish became Albert for you,
something like that. But it didn't really change anything. The point was still very vividly in my mind. So I sort of I put that on the shelf for a number of years. I got really involved in blogging, and I was kind of one of these like proud liberal Mormons at the time, because I was online in the early 2000s blogging a lot and kind of exploring ideas. And then the other thing, which we'll get to, Margaret, is your name would always kind of pop up in and out, but you were always sort of like this taboo subject, because it's like, well, but that's Margaret Toscano. She's been X'd, and, so take it with a grain of salt, which there was like this weird, there was like two sides to that, because in one side of my head, I was like, but her opinions, her work is still valid. Like it exists independent of her excommunication, right? But then the other side of me was like this Mormon male sort of like, I can just dismiss it all. She's been excommunicated. So I sort of wrestled with your, this sounds really weird, but I wrestled with your identity and how to take you credibly for a number of years as I read your work. And, but it was still like making an impact on you, obviously. Yeah, it was. Well, I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't have admitted it at that time, but it did.
Yeah. You know what is so, for me, poignant is that when I was at my excommunication council, I always want to call it a trial because it felt like a trial.
Right.
But they don't like to use that word anymore, or court, I guess, which was the old term. But one of the reasons they gave me for why they had to excommunicate me was that they said, we don't want people to believe what you say. And on the one hand, it was like they would not, the stake president, he would not let me speak and defend myself. They wouldn't argue with me on doctrine. But at the same time, they were saying, well, you're wrong. And yet they wouldn't let me try to show, why my views could be, consistent with Mormon doctrines. And so it was very sad and frustrating for me that it was like, we want to label you as an apostate so people will not believe you. And I kept saying in different contexts, both at that court, but also in previous meetings with my leaders, it was like, I am just a regular member. I'm a woman and a member. You have priesthood authority. I mean, the members are more likely to believe you than they are me, so why can't you let me have a voice?
Right.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you're appealing to reason and creating this dissonance in their brains that they can't stand, so they have to silence you like Saruman or something, a big nerd reference to Lord of the Rings.
What do you want, Gandalf Greyhaim? Let me guess. The key of Orthanc? Or perhaps the keys of Barad-dûr itself?
but
no,
haven't you all? I think you said, Margaret, that afterwards somebody said to you they were really impressed with you, or something along those lines. So was it just they were impressed at the times that you were just silent and listened, or if they wouldn't let you argue?
The stake president didn't give me a lot of opportunities to address issues. I mean, they did give me a few chances to speak, but at the end of the court, they did say that they were impressed with me. And it was funny, though, because they said, you're so passionate and you're so intelligent. And and it was almost like I wasn't sure if it was a compliment or not.
Right, yeah.
It's like, wow, and I also had a couple of leaders tell me that they were frightened to talk with me, which again surprised me. I don't ever see myself as, intimidating at all. It doesn't seem like I intimidate my freshmen in my large 250 myth class. But I wish I intimidated that group more. But it is strange to me that you have leaders that are so they seem to be afraid to really engage with ideas. They want to use their authority always to shut down voices. And
right.
And not even dissent, just discussions.
Well, and I think that's where the intimidation comes from, because I think it's a little bit of a double standard in the sense that looking back, I don't think it's so much that you're intrinsically intimidating as much as it is that you're just at their level. You're an equal. You're talking to them like a man would talk to them, and that's just by definition scary because you're a woman, but you're not doing anything all that scary. It's just you're having a real conversation and suggesting things and offering ideas that many men have done before, but it's just where it's coming from that makes it intimidating, even though it's really just kind of that same level of discourse. It's just a normal discussion by most standards outside of the Mormon paradox of
Well, and I think
women.
You're absolutely right that if you speak to a leader as an equal, as though you're just assuming that you have equal status, it's even worse if you're a woman. But I think even for a man, they expect a deference.
Right.
And
they really do.
Yeah, they really do. They expect this sort of deference. And if you don't give that to them, then they're offended.
Which is such a strange thing to be offended about. Of all the things that are going wrong in your life, somebody doesn't give you deference. It's such a, I don't know, it just feels so petty by comparison to all the real reasons to take offense, in my opinion anyway. I don't know. It seems pretty small-minded.
Do you think that's generational, though? I mean, because I think about my dad, I think about my grandfather, and that, like, even me asking certain questions of, like, Dad, why are you asking me to do this? His go-to answer was, because I told you. It's like, just obey.
Yeah, my dad did that sometimes,
right,
too.
Don't ask questions. And I almost feel like for me, growing up with things like Sesame Street and, other things that I think opened the windows of understanding maybe a little bit more. Bob, I know we've had this conversation about like the generational differences maybe, but I feel like, to me, I think there's a value in explaining to my kids why, and not demanding fear and reverence and, that sort of thing. But I think that was a value in previous generations.
Well, but it also
and I think
transcends. You're
right in terms of, I guess this is one way in which I've never fit into my generation. I'm 65. I've decided I'm going to stop lying about my age. I am what I am, right? And I hope I can teach for another 15 years. I don't plan on retiring anytime soon. But at any rate, I think maybe that's part of what was disturbing about me to leaders, both my own age and those that were older, is that they did, people of my generation, you're expected to just simply, use authority. And I've never done that. Even with my children, I never was one that said, just do it because I said so. Yeah. And in fact, when my husband and I we actually got in trouble a lot, even before 1993. But when Paul and I were being brought in by our state president in the summer of 93, right before the September 6th thing happened, our state president used the analogy. He was trying to get us to simply agree to be silent. Mm-hmm. He said, you can believe what you want, but you can't talk about anything like this in any kind of public arena. And he meant any kind of arena. And he said, you should do this simply because I have asked you to do it as your state president. And he said, just like you would ask your children to do things just because you're their parents, I am asking you the same thing. Oh, and wow. Paul and I started laughing, and we said, we never ask our children to do something just because we said so.
So you totally invalidated him right off the start.
So you're kind of using the wrong analogy. Yeah.
So I've talked about this a couple times, and it's really resonated with both generations. This idea that, let's talk about the generation, like different cultures that our leaders are coming out of, like, listen to what I say, respect is really important because I said so shows me that you have respect for me. And that's how you show me respect, is to listen without question. And it also shows loyalty, and we don't air our dirty laundry. And it's this kind of post-World War II mentality of like in-group, out-group, like the way that we show our loyalty and respect and love to the group and to each other and our leaders is this kind of mental model. And then I talk about my generation, which is millennials, and very much like authenticity and ask questions and information age. And you have to earn respect. It's not just a given, and you have to explain why you're doing something a certain way, and it has to be evidence-based, or let's change up the system. Right. And so the older generation is being, offended and hurt by this young generation that's like, no, we want things to change, and we're going to get in lines and try to make it happen, and they're so offended that we won't just listen to, please don't come to Temple Square. And the younger generation is saying, look, if you're not going to show me proof or show me, tell the truth about your history, I can't trust you. And you have to, and so it's these very fascinating dynamics, this intergenerational dynamics that I think have a lot to do with some of the people leaving the church at this generation, have to do a lot with some of the angst that's being felt on both sides.
And I think when you have an institution that's a very conservative institution like the LDS Church is, they're going to cling to the values of yesteryear. They won't be as quick to move in, even though you'll have people moving into the corridors of power like a Bednar or others younger that have been raised in this generation. I think they're being selected out because they still carry those older school values, and you'll have a conservative organization like the church that is slower to catch up.
Right, yeah. And I think you're absolutely right. They're not going to put somebody in leadership who doesn't share that value system, that does not go according to what they see as the rules of the game. And I think you're absolutely right, Chelsea. that was so evident when we did those actions on Temple Square with the Ordain Women, that their view of respect and our view of respect was totally different. I mean, I think for those of us who were part of the action, we saw ourselves as being very respectful, but they did not. Because from their point of view, we told you not to come, and the very fact that you're here and you didn't obey us, that means that you are being very disrespectful and that you're being disobedient in a way that really makes you, you have your membership, should be in question now because you have not acted according to our rules. We warned you and you didn't listen.
Which is so strange because, organizational behavior 101 is diversity of opinion is a good thing. You facilitate it, you put boundaries around it, you do it in a respectful way, but you avoid groupthink. You can't just hire your friends and have a successful business. But that's, I'm just thinking like from my business education or whatever. But like the church kind of uses the opposite model of, I don't know what to call it. It's almost like a flavor of nepotism, or it's just you have to pass a pretty high bar of thinking like me before you can join the club at the leadership level, and it just perpetuates this slowness of progression because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that if you only pick people who completely agree with you and treat respect as agreeing with you instead of what respect really can be, you can be respectful and disagree, but it's just there's just not an environment for that to flourish in the church, at least at the leadership level. And I don't know what to do about it, but that's just what we're up against in terms of. And
the thing that seems so frustrating is that it seems obvious that this is counterproductive, that it would be, it would be so much more conducive to keeping people and to actually creating a kind of, to me, what would be a more spiritual environment if you actually could have people trying to speak the truth. And speak honestly with each other and discuss things. To me, that creates a better environment. But they obviously don't see it like that.
Yeah. So when you do something like with what the Ordain Women movement did, physically putting your bodies there in Temple Square, and I don't want to set up a false this or that, binary situation here, but in my head, I'm thinking, are you doing this because primarily you want to expose these terrible practices that are so ingrained in the organization that they can't hide from it, and that's just out there for the world to see, and that's one of the main objectives? Or is it more, and there's probably a spectrum and other options here, is it we think that this is really going to change the institution in the short term or long term, and we're going to see progress where women are given more opportunities to be on an equal footing with men in the church?
It'd be interesting to see my view on this versus Chelsea's. I saw it as more of a symbolic gesture. Mm-hmm. From my perspective, I didn't think it was going to lead to any kind of immediate change. Mm-hmm. And maybe this is because of what I've been through and what I've seen, that I didn't think it was going to lead to anything directly. But I thought it was still important for us to do. Mm-hmm. I thought it was important, and both it was important both because it was something we had to say to the leaders, and I don't think they will not listen any other way. If we hadn't done it so publicly, they wouldn't have listened. So I think that was important, but also I think it does expose the rigidity of the system and the hierarchical nature of it, and really some of the abusive practices, which are often, that is one of, I think, the goals of activism and of, some principles that were laid out in the civil rights movement, that you do something that ask for a response, and if the people with power respond, in this abusive way, you're showing that there's something really inherently wrong with the system. So for me, I saw it as both a mechanism for talking to the leaders, but also to the outside world. And I see it as just a part of a long process of making change. I didn't expect it to be an immediate change. And by the way, I knew they would excommunicate Kate way before. I mean, I suspected it. And then, the more I saw after our April action, when they did their press release, and then you had the statements by Otterson, I knew they were setting her up for an excommunication, which made me very sad. Yeah. So I don't know. I'm interested in Chelsea's response, how you feel about this, Chelsea.
I mean, I think it's a little of both. I mean, you did a great job, I think, summing it up. And part of it is as an activist, you don't always get to control what the outcome is or the effect. So we might say, oh, it's about consciousness or anything. We want everyone to see this thing. Or we might say, no. I mean, Kate legitimately thought she would get in and she would, be able to witness this. And, she might think that, but Margaret and I might be like, come on, we've been trying to do things like this, communicate with leaders for years. Any way you can think, from sending roses to writing letters to doing petitions to doing websites, and we've never had a response. So I think some of us in the crowd were a little less authentically thinking we were going to accomplish something that day, but some people were. So it's just a complicated type of group dynamic.
Sure.
I agree, Chelsea. I mean, I think that people had very differing feelings about why we were there and what we were doing and what we would accomplish. But that always happens, as you say, Chelsea, with activism or any kind of group action. There's going to be many perspectives on even what's happening at the moment.
Right. So one question I had for you, Margaret, is as much as I've sort of kept up with some of the things you've written and some of your interesting ideas on Heavenly Mother and women in the priesthood and these sorts of things, I thought it might be nice of you to, if you're willing, to explain where you stand with not only the church, because I know you've said before, you don't consider yourself LDS, but you consider yourself Mormon, which I think is a fun way of saying it, but maybe going a little bit deeper on your relationship with God, with religion, with spirituality, whatever it is. I would just love to know more about how you reconcile all of that together, since you've sort of been through Mormonism inside and out.
Right. Yes, I'm willing to talk about that. I can talk for a long time, you guys. So, but before we end our conversation tonight, I also really want to address, since we were just talking about priesthood, I really want to address the question of whether or not I believe in a separate priesthood for women.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to hear that.
Because I actually feel like I have a really complicated views on this, and I think I'm sometimes misunderstood. So I would love to clear that up, and I've kind of been thinking about that since Chelsea sent me the questions. But we can start with this question of faith. It's really interesting that I think everybody goes through periods in their life where maybe you believe more at one time than you do at another time. And that, at least for me, kind of where I am with my faith or with my relationship to God, I've gone through so many different stages in my life. And I guess that I would, I sometimes now call myself, I'll either say that I am a believing skeptic or a skeptical believer or a doubting believer, or sometimes I'll even call myself an agnostic, although probably those other two descriptions are more accurate.
How about a hopeful agnostic?
A hopeful agnostic.
Oh, Glenn.
I think I'm the kind of person that by nature I doubt everything. And I'm always questioning myself and questioning my beliefs. But I think that sort of by nature, deep down, I have a mystical side that I believe that there's something. I believe that the soul is eternal and that there's a divine power in the world. But I've had many periods where I have not been able to feel anything, and I have doubted it. And I also have to say, which I also find a little bit ironic, that unlike Mormon, I don't think that I ever went through that sort of, that I wouldn't say it's typical, but I think it's common for the Mormon intellectual, where you're kind of in a faith position as a child, and, you know, you like the church and it seems good to you, and then you have something that really shocks you and shatters your faith and your trust in leaders, often because you find out historical things, or, you know, that the church has not been honest and all the typical things. Now, those have also bothered me, but my whole journey has been very different in the sense that maybe in part it's because I was part of this old Mormon family where my parents were very open, and so I knew about a lot of things as a child that other people don't find out, and then they're shocked. Like, I knew Joseph Smith was the polygamist. I had mentioned to Glenn that, well, my family didn't have this tradition, that my great-great-grandmother could have been one of the wives of Joseph Smith, but my father had stories from his grandmother about Nauvoo, so I knew a lot of that stuff. So it didn't come to me as a shock. So I didn't really go through that, everything is wonderful, and then I find out these things and I have this traumatic experience. For me, sort of my journey was that I would probably describe myself as somebody who kind of naturally believed in God, but that when I was a teenager, I read a lot, and I found church incredibly boring and just not interesting.
You and me both.
Yeah, so maybe you were like that too. Again, maybe there are a lot of people that had my journey, and so it was like, I'd get more spirituality out of reading Tolstoy than I do, or Dostoevsky, than I do, listening to conference or going to church. And so for me, it was, I didn't have that, I didn't really have a disillusionment. It was just, is there anything here? It seems so shallow. It doesn't seem interesting. Although I did have this interesting family history, which I was always very compelled by. But I went to BYU. I mean, I'm not sure why I decided to go that route, but I did. But when I was at BYU, I actually, it was through my first husband. I was married before I was married to Paul, and he was really into church history and documents. And in fact, I met Mike Quinn through my first husband. My first husband was named Guy. I met Mike Quinn through him, and I met Paul, my husband, through him. And I started finding out new things that I hadn't heard from from my childhood. And I was really fascinated with church history and doctrine and theology. And I thought, wow, maybe there's something in this church, at least this is not boring. And for me, that was a step up, right?
Right.
But also when I was at BYU at that time, I was still really questioning my beliefs. That was just part of who I was always from the time I was young. And, but then when I was at BYU, the women's issues, and this was in the 70s, the women's issues really started bothering me. It was so obviously unfair on every level, not just church things, but that at BYU, even academic things, the male priesthood leaders always had the power and the resources and the first pick at jobs and everything else. And so that really bothered me, the whole issue of women's place. And so I went through a real crisis of faith over that.
And Margaret, wasn't one of the things that you read that was like historical that started making the church seem a little more interesting and like there was opportunities for theological exploration? There was a quote from Brigham Young about women and the priesthood and men and the priesthood, and you had this kind of aha moment that, this may be something that's already there?
Yeah, you really have read a lot that I've written.
No, I've just listened recently.
I think I told about that at one point, that I was reading in the Journal of Discourses, and I found this quote by Brigham Young where he said, "The man who honors his priesthood and the woman who honors hers will have an everlasting place in the kingdom of God." So I started, really searching for things. And that, the crisis of faith I was having over feminist issues led me to ask the question, is there anything here that could possibly make women equal within this religious system? Because I just couldn't see myself wanting to even stay if there wasn't at least a theological possibility. There was obviously no structural possibility at that point. But I thought, well, is there anything in, both Mormonism, but also Christianity or Judaism? And I started doing a lot of reading with feminist theologians in all traditions, and also got really interested in the goddess traditions at that point, thinking about how all of these things work together. So this really started at the end of my undergrad, and my undergrad was in English, and then I did a master's in classics, Greek and Latin. I was doing a lot with biblical studies just to see, can I find anything in these traditions that gives me a possibility that God could value me as much as he values these men? Because for me, if that weren't true, then how could I want to stay in a system that simply made me eternally second class?
Right.
That just didn't seem appealing to me, even though, and again, I was always questioning my faith, and even experiences that I had that I felt were spiritual experiences. You may have read, I've talked about it a couple of times, that when I was in my 20s, I went through a lot of depression. And then because of my first marriage, my husband was unfaithful to me, and I went through a really painful divorce. And during that period, I had several experiences where I felt, overwhelmed by some power that, and for me at the time, I felt very much that it was Jesus Christ. I felt like that this love from something outside of me that made me feel valued, and that I was eternally worthwhile and precious, in a way that, because of this very painful marriage and rejection from my first husband, and also being at BYU, where I felt that I was so undervalued as a woman. And I'm sure that these experiences where I felt this love and acceptance, which also changed my view on salvation. I felt that it had nothing to do with what I had done or not done, that somehow I was just worthwhile. And I had several transformative experiences. Now, you can always doubt them later, and I have, say, was that just me? What was it? But they were very powerful. And so I think that those experiences made me want to try to find something theologically that
could help you understand what it was.
Yeah, exactly. If these feelings I had from these spiritual experiences were real, where there is some kind of divine power that sees me, as very much, as important in the eternal scheme of things as any, male prophet, then I wanted to know theologically. This is just me. Feeling alone is not enough for me. Obviously feelings are important, but emotions, I had to see if I could find possibilities within the religion, because there was always the possibility that even if these spiritual experiences were real, it wasn't like it was confirming Mormonism.
Right.
And in fact, this has been an interesting thing about my spiritual journey, is that I always found that when I ask questions about, is this true or isn't this true, or if I ask, should I do this or should I do that, all I get is silence. It's like, those are stupid questions, don't ask those. But if I ask for enlightenment or I ask for comfort, for me, that's always been something I could access, and I've sort of come to believe that, if my spiritual inklings are true at all, that those kind of decisions about right and wrong, I think those are left to us and our agency to figure out. That, for me, these kind of higher enlightenment and questions of receiving love and giving love are a much more important part of what a spiritual journey is about.
So it sounds like you were able to parse apart pretty early on, at least. Maybe it's the natural thing for me to do is to compare myself to you. I don't mean to be
making yourself the subject.
Yeah, there you go. Right, that's me, the man. But I'm just interested in how you were able to keep your spirituality separate from the religion that rejected you and that ultimately proved itself to be. I don't know if you want to go as far as to say it's false. That's a loaded statement that you can pick that apart too. But I'm just saying for myself, it was also interconnected that, I only had a period of so many days or weeks where I flirted with organized religion or spirituality in the traditional Christian sense beyond just the ultimate conclusion of rejecting it, almost all of it, other than just like the general be nice to your neighbor, like Beatitudes and like New Testament Christ stuff, which is like you really don't need a church to live a good life and be good to your neighbors or whatever. So I'm just curious how you were able to hold on, or how that process unfolded where you maintained a belief in God, whoever he or she is, versus Mormonism not taking that away from you like it did for so many of us.
Yeah. No, and I think it's easy when religions do horrible things, and, even if it's not the level of horrible, but they do disappointing things, that
right.
It takes away, it really does undermine your faith. And I have to say, in spite of what I said before, I feel like that my experiences in the church did undermine my faith. I feel like I moved through it, and it's not as though I still have lots of doubts and am not certain that I'm right about anything, and maybe there's nothing after this life. I feel there is, but I could be wrong, right? And of course I distrust kind of a certainty. I don't like self-righteousness. I don't like certainty. But but hope is important for me. I liked when you used that word. So maybe one of the ways that I held on for so long, I guess that's the other question, because I started questioning very early, and yet I held on for a long time. I think for some reason, and I don't know why this was, but I always sort of trusted my own authority, my own take on things. I remember even, in junior high being told things in church and thinking that's not right. And I trusted my own sense of right and wrong and my own kind of spiritual inclinations and voice more than I did leaders. Wow. So I always did that. And I don't know why I did that, but I just did. I always, it's like, well, if I can't trust my own, I could be wrong, but I at least have to try to go on what I believe. And what I found is that, if you're wrong, you're going to discover it if you're open to it. But I always did trust my own spiritual judgment more than the judgment of leaders. And I think that made it possible that I could stay in the church, because it was like, I'm not buying most of this, but I still find some value in the community. Mm-hmm. And I guess it goes even back to the feminist activism, the feeling that, there need to be changes and somebody has to be a voice to speak for changes.
Right.
So I think that's part of it. At this point in my life, I cannot see myself going, being in the church again. And I'm not sure I really want to, because at least the way the church is right now, because they do demand an allegiance, and I could not support the leaders with a lot of the things they do.
Yeah, and that sort of begs the question, do you see progress having been made in the last few years, or let's just take it since your excommunication in 2000? Do you think these baby steps should be celebrated where the church is like, all right, women can pray at a conference or whatever? Or do you think it's just, pardon my French, it's just all horse shit and it's, sort of lip service and it's not really anything, nothing's changed?
I'm afraid that sort of my deepest feeling is that nothing has changed, because structurally, I think that the changes are really superficial.
Right.
The only thing that I think, on the other hand, if you say, well, I'd rather have women pray than not pray, right?
Sure.
I'd rather have women be able to, be on the ward council rather than not be on the ward council. I'd rather women be able to nurse their babies in church than not nurse their babies, right?
Right.
So, and I guess that one hasn't happened, though. But at any rate, one of the things that is frustrating about these kinds of questions, and it'd be interesting to get Chelsea's response on this, too, that I think as feminists, we're sort of put into these false dichotomies that often, and I don't even know if it's a false dichotomy, but at least it's kind of a false kind of argument.
Okay.
Where, it's like, and some of us have seen it in terms of like good girls versus bad girls, the women who are willing to sort of, not be too strident, and they're going to, just work for little tiny changes and be satisfied with that. And if we say, well, I'm not satisfied with it, then you're seen as, the bad girl, you're so disrespectful. It comes back to all of that rhetoric. And, that's frustrating to kind of be. And then I feel like what happens is we start arguing, the feminists argue among themselves rather than feeling like, there are some of the bigger goals that we can have some, that we can work on, because we're all arguing about these other questions. And right. Which is frustrating to me. But I have to say that kind of deep down, I don't feel like that many of these changes have mattered, because the power structure of the church is very much still this male hierarchical system.
Yeah, and I want to hear from Chelsea, but I just want to set up the next question because I think it really ties in nicely. And so I'm just going to say it, and then we can come back to it. This sort of speaks to the whole, reform and fight inside of Mormonism, and keep going with these incremental changes and baby steps in an organization that's just kind of doomed based on its structure, versus the opportunity cost of working for feminist issues, in the big outside world, outside of Salt Lake City and Mormon headquarters and that sort of thing. And if we can philosophize, I know philosophizing isn't action, but what the pros and cons are, if it's worth hanging on and trying to change something inside of the world we grew up in versus just giving up on it and trying to support the changes that are happening much faster outside of that world. So
you got that, everyone? We're going to be able to come back to this one after Chelsea. This is one of those like really long bob points that I'm going to have to edit down.
Yeah, later. I know. I told you. I mean, I can tell we're all talkers, right?
Right.
Well, I was going to actually give you guys, and maybe we should fill Margaret in after I ask this question, but we've been discussing here and online how do men engage in these feminist worlds without being dismissive or mansplaining when they're terrified they're going to say something wrong or get in trouble. And they have cases even today of like online dialogue, and even in our 2-hour 3-hour podcast where you and I, me and the boys kind of like back and forth thought and kind of tried to get at that. And I wanted to have you guys talk a little bit about that based on what Margaret just said. And here's what I mean by that is that I've experienced everything Margaret's saying, that I was a good, feminist, trying to work with my local leaders, trying not to, say anything against the church, use the right language, hold their hand, and walk them through the process. The second I, stood with Kate, I'm a bad feminist. Now I'm not being as respectful enough in order to make changes. So I can be dismissed because I'm not respectful. So it's that whole debate we've had lots of times on these podcasts between being right and being effective. But what's interesting, if we kind of overlay this onto the recent debates here on Infants on Thrones we're having about feminists and feminism and online, what I see too is that my role currently is to be the good feminist, to kind of hold the hand of the males and walk them through the process and in really sweet words, and to be polite and kind, and to kind of help with consciousness raising and not alienating, and to kind of be that middle way. And that when a woman responds even to male allies outside of a Mormon context in the way of, that's your job. If you want to be a feminist, you need to go and do the research and figure it out. If you don't understand, then, ask a question. But if I tell you that you saying, but my experience as a man is just as that, or whatever, then you don't understand. So I think it's fascinating here to have these interplaying scripts going on between Kate and you guys online and me and you here, and then talking about good and bad feminists, which the feminist world, Margaret, and I can tell you, was rattled by these divisions. I mean, in previous generations, where the whole Mormon feminist resistance fought at each other and separated and divided and fought against each other. And I think the modern incarnation is doing a pretty good job to work together, even though, we don't always agree on ordination, or we don't always agree on the best routes to change or whatever. And that's because we've made a conscious effort with, people like Margaret kind of shepherding us through these new activist movements. But these are really fascinating. There's too much there. So sorry.
No, well, and in fact, I'm really glad you said what you did, Chelsea, because this connects to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, which is that in spite of the fact that I don't see, I'm not hopeful when I look at the structure of the church, because I don't see significant changes there. What I do see as a change is the interaction and reaction of younger Mormon women. Because if you look at my generation, even women who actually secretly believed that priesthood and they wanted to participate in the church structure, they would never say it out loud. And right. I always, Lori Stromberg and I and others, there were just a handful of us who were willing to speak publicly and say, we believe that women should be ordained, that women do have spiritual power and priesthood, and they should be ordained into the structure of the church. And I have to say that I was extremely moved in the Ordain Women movement to see how many younger women and men were willing to say publicly that there needed to be a change, and that they just seemed to accept this. The idea of women being ordained, it seemed natural to them in a way that I would have to argue with people for hours to even get them to think about the possibility. So I think right. I do see some change there that I think is hopeful, in a younger generation. And fortunately, I think it's because the world at large is different, and that younger women just expect a sort of equality of treatment that didn't even occur to women of my generation, that you had to do all this consciousness raising to get them to even think about it. Right. Now, there are still problems in the church. I mean, I had a discussion with a group of students who are in our religious studies program at the University of Utah about a year ago. And one of the women there, she also took a Latin class from me. And it was really funny because she had seen the documentary, The Mormons, and when she saw me on that, she thought I was this evil, horrible woman. Then she took Latin from me, and it was about halfway through the semester, it finally dawned on her that I was the same person. And she was like shocked. But we became friends, and she decided I wasn't evil after all. And but she said to me, and this was, I see this as so much, part of the problem, in spite of the fact that you have an opening with the younger generation. This is what she said. She said, I would never accept unequal treatment in the workplace. So she's in her early 20s. Mm-hmm. But it's okay with me in the church.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah, and I've heard other young women say this.
Compartmentalization.
And I said, well, why? Why are you willing to accept, this in the church when you wouldn't somewhere else? Do you think it's right? And she said, well, I feel good at church. I feel that the people are good and that the religion is good. And therefore, I'm kind of just willing to accept, I feel like I'm valued on some level. Right. So, and then you wonder, well, is she being set up for some kind of horrible disillusionment when she finds out that the leaders have lied? And maybe so. But I think that's a real problem that we have, is that people, they do divide. It's like, well, this is okay in the church because we know that the leaders are inspired, and obviously if God wanted to ordain women, he would have told the prophet.
But isn't the irony there that it's also that the leaders are inspired that makes people want to fight for the change? And what I mean to say is I've had not just men, women tell me, in comments and offline that one of the reasons that they're not interested in putting a profile on Ordain Women or supporting it publicly, even though, in theory it's totally a fine thing for believers, is because once you're not a believer, once you see the church for what it is as kind of more of a destructive force because of this hierarchy and this authoritarian model, that it's sort of petitioning an abusive husband to stop beating his wife instead of helping the wife leave the husband in the first place. And maybe that's an unfair analogy, but I didn't create it myself. I'm just throwing it out there to understand if it's just a difference of perspective, because believers, of course, can't leave because they believe, versus people who don't believe anymore in the Mormon Church as the source of, the pipeline to God, the unique, I'm already forgetting my Mormon,
right.
terminology, the one true church. I just wonder, I'm not trying to say or to discredit the effort, but it's hard to unite believers and non-believers with that fundamental difference of perspective on what's happening. Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. And in fact, I sort of feel like I'm very inconsistent in my views on this, because I am really glad that my daughters are not in the church. And, I have 4 daughters. They're in their 30s now. And so when Paul was excommunicated, our youngest was 9 and our oldest was 15. And basically we all, none of us really went back after his excommunication, even though Paul and I have been involved in the, Mormon intellectual community. But none of my daughters really, they were not raised as Orthodox Mormons ever. And then they never went back. But I just don't think, I don't think it's good for women in a lot of ways, which is not to say that there isn't good that's done there or that people don't have good experiences, because I think they do. So this is where I think that I'm almost sounding contradictory. So on the one hand, I'm glad my daughters are not part of it. And even recently, one of my daughters, she has her close friend who still goes to church, but she went through a very bad marriage, and she now says she will not date Mormon men.
Wow.
And although she still goes to church. And so this was my response. Oh, good for her. I think it's much better if she marries a non-Mormon. and that's not to say anything against, I know a lot of good Mormon men, so it's not like they're all like that. But so part of me, I feel kind of split, because part of me feels like that, worry about how women, especially how they start to feel about themselves and what they can do. So I worry about women, and yet there's a way in which I still care about, because I care about the people. I want changes to happen. And I think you need, and Chelsea's much more of the activist, in theory in that than I am, but I think you always need both the radicals who are more outside and the inside people who are trying to work for changes. So I want people to, try to work from within, but I do worry about the damage it does to them.
Right.
Does it kind of come to a cultural relativism in some ways, where you can look at the student that you talked about earlier, Margaret, who feels very like she recognizes that there is an inequality, but that space is filled with something that's valuable to her. So
Absolutely.
So she doesn't feel out of balance where she needs to put something back into balance, and that there are good people who are going to have that perception. There's others that are going to have a different perception, and so I think it comes down to that relativity thing, and that's where the struggle is. Because you know where you are,
and people do have good experiences in the church.
Yeah.
Even if you look at writings about women in religion, and I'm trying to remember who said this, it doesn't matter, but one of the problems with women in religion in terms of their position is that most religious systems both empower women and also subordinate them. In other words, if they were only mistreated and subordinated, there are many reasons for staying in something, but it would be less likely. But the fact is they feel some kind of fulfillment and goodness as well as being put in a subordinate position. Those things happen simultaneously.
Right.
So they will say, well, they feel good serving other people, or being a Relief Society president, they felt like they did a lot of good, and so there are many, many examples of ways in which women feel as though, that their religious community really helps them, and so they put up with the rest of it for various reasons.
Interesting. And it's interesting because some of the examples you gave, intentionally or not, are all the kind of stuff that's like not exclusive to Mormonism, like having a structure through which you visit your neighbor frequently, or you get together on a weekly basis, not even in a religious context. You can find this elsewhere, but for some reason, of course, Mormonism is a package deal. There's a lot of other richness, of course, that I know you're more of an expert on than I am, in fact, in terms of theology to play with, and exciting concepts that sort of come from this larger concept of modern revelation. So I don't know how much that plays into it, this indirect specialness, which is kind of ironic because the examples you gave I've heard before as well, and they're the ones that usually float to the surface first as the reason to feel good about the church, but they're also the least interesting to me looking from the outside, because you can find them anywhere.
No, and I agree with you. And, for me, this sort of feeling part of a community was not my reason for staying, maybe partly because I'm sort of a on the Myers-Briggs scale, I'm an INXP or something, right? So I'm kind of, I'm not, really good at that sort of thing. So, but I think for some people it is. But you're right; you can find that in many different contexts. Although,
doesn't that make it a more human thing, though? I mean,
I think it is. I think it is. I mean, you look at why religious structures are important. I mean, if we go back to the question of, I was talking about my sort of spiritual journey and, struggling with faith and all of that. But, and there's what I see as a false dichotomy, is sort of like, thinking of spirituality as good and religion as bad. They both have their pros and cons. You you can end up being a really spiritual, goofy person.
Right.
I've tried really hard not to be a goofy person over the years. But, you want to be in touch with reality. And communities always have good and bad aspects to them. It doesn't matter what community you're a part of. And I think that that's one of the things that people do miss, though, when they leave the church. It's like we need communities, but communities are hard. It's hard to make any community work.
Yeah.
So you're right. It's not like, Mormonism isn't the only place to find that. On the other hand, it is hard to find a religious community that you feel comfortable in. Right. I haven't had a desire to go out and find a new religious community.
Nor have I.
It doesn't appeal to me. It's like, I don't want to, I'm not going to join any of them. And yet there are parts I miss, So it's complicated. And I think one of the problems in the church is that, and, I'm sure a lot of you have talked about this on blogs and so forth, but that the church does not allow people to really be comfortable in kind of a middle place where they say, well, I don't really buy into the truth claims, or I don't really accept the leaders as prophets, but I enjoy being part of the community and I just sort of want to participate. That's not put forth as an option.
It's all or nothing.
Yeah, which I think also can create a bad situation for people trying to struggle with their own beliefs. That my daughter said about, again, they're not in the church, but she said, about some of the people she sees that leave the LDS Church. She goes, I feel like they go from being a naive believer where they just accept everything, and suddenly they're a naive unbeliever. and they have no subtlety or nuance about the complexity. Let's face it. Truth is really complex, trying to figure out what really happened and trying to figure out, how to deal with the complexity of human experience. I think one of the things that sort of has kept me kind of maybe tilted sometimes to a believing, although I sort of see myself as going back and forth, I see life as very mysterious. For me, the mystery of human existence is life is so strange. Mm-hmm. And I like that the church doesn't help people deal with the complexity of things. They want it to be this kind of simple all or nothing, which I don't think helps anybody. It keeps you, one of the things I feel with a lot of Mormons is that it keeps them kind of very spiritually immature. You're not encouraged to think about things or read books or anything, which that is so damaging.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good segue to this topic of priesthood and some of your ideas on that and some of the stuff you've written. And you said you wanted to clarify. And I thought it'd be fun to set it up like with a thought experiment where like the church office building out of the blue calls you up, calls Margaret Toscano up and says, you know what, we've screwed up and we thought we'd write a new edition of Mormon doctrine. And in this new edition, we're going to add some new sections and we want you to author them and lead this new committee of creating new doctrine to fill some of the holes that we haven't really given.
Oh, wow. What a fantasy, right? Actually,
right.
One of the first things I would do?
What's that?
We need to rewrite the temple ceremony.
Okay, you'd start there. That probably makes sense.
Actually, I don't know if I would start there, but you know what? I think that's central.
Yeah.
Because the way the temple is set up now, where you have women as being made, priestesses to their husbands, that, and if you think of the temple as this most sacred space, mm-hmm. that sets up an eternal imbalance that nothing else will correct.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I would probably start there with the fact that no more ordaining women to be priestesses unto their husbands. Everybody's a priest unto God. And there is evidence that that was actually how the ordinations in Nauvoo started out, and then it was changed later.
Is there any reason to keep them sitting on separate sides for some symbolic reason, or would you have them all just kind of sit wherever? And I'm just curious if
so actually maybe I should back up a little bit to go to one of the things that's really interesting with symbology and ritual, and I know Chelsea has, with her anthropology background, has thought a lot about ritual too, is that rituals are very complex, and just because something seems bad, to just simply eliminate it, you often end up with a sort of vacuum that then is not, again, it's not interesting, it's just kind of blah. Mm-hmm. So, probably for some this would, that what I'm going to say will now show that I am really an apostate. But,
Uh-oh, I think we lost you, Margaret. I think God's censoring you right now.
I think what
there was maybe some old men who kind of, groped women when they would embrace the veil.
Whoa. We lost some audio there. We got to back up.
We missed something.
You guys don't know about this?
No. Back up and explain. You cut out for part of it, and we just heard men groping women at the veil.
So, and of course, you can all eliminate all of this if you don't want to put this up or anything.
No, it's great.
We're going to lead with it.
The old temple ceremony, and of course, I haven't been in the temple for years because I've been an apostate for so long. But part of the temple ceremony, at the very end, you were given what they call the 5 points of fellowship. Mm-hmm. And when you went to the veil, you were supposed to be embracing God through the veil, right? Although here again, the marriage ceremony put the woman's husband there, but I totally disagree with that interpretation. Mm-hmm. Did you hear the part when I talked about that?
No, not really.
So I don't know where I got cut off. So I started out by saying that I would first change the temple ceremony so women are not priestesses to their husbands, right?
Right.
You did hear that?
We heard that part, yeah.
Yeah, and then I sort of jumped. Then you ask, well, would I not have women and men sit on separate sides? And I hesitate on that because symbology is very complex. And to try to make everything sort of a linear, simplistic view of equality, to me ends up creating a kind of lukewarm system. And I'm going to have to go back to explain my idea about priesthood on another level too with this. But so
can I offer something on the sides though?
Go ahead.
Because I think an important part of ritual is this thing called liminality, which is you're stepping outside of the norm. So in the normal world, Bob, you might intermingle with women and sit everywhere you want to, and that's fine. But in the temple, if there's certain places, like if there's a division that's outside of the norm, then maybe that would contribute to this liminal thing, like I'm stepping into a place that's not normal.
Right. In fact, I don't know, Bob, if you ever read the chapter, which was actually written by me in Strangers in Paradox, on the veil, rending the veil.
Yeah, I mean, a long time ago, but I remember
chapter,
it.
So this is it's a chapter in Strangers that started out with a talk that I gave, and I kind of rewrote it many, many times. But I was struggling with, again, imagery in the temple. So, of course, the veil that women wear in the temple can be seen as an image of subordination and of, inferior status. And when you veil your face, that can be seen as, somehow the woman is less worthy and she can't see the God face to face. So in this piece that I wrote, I explored the way veil symbolism is used in a lot of ancient rituals. And I try to talk about, first of all, the whole question of, where does the veil symbolism come from in the Mormon Temple? And I was looking so it kind of goes along. Was it you, Glenn, that just said that thing about liminality?
Yeah, that was.
But what I was going to say is that this is the interesting thing. I can accept the veil as a good symbol in the temple, but I would never agree to be veiled in everyday life.
Right.
And to me, it would just be abhorrent if someone tried to say I had to wear a veil. But I accepted the temple because for me in the temple, it has a lot of layers of meaning that go beyond just simply, a subordination of women. And so in this article that I wrote, I talk about that it's really interesting that if you go, for example, into the ancient Mediterranean world, that often it was the priest who wore the veil, not just women priestesses, but you had male priests that would wear, they wouldn't have maybe called it a veil, but they wore like a head covering. And then at certain places in the ceremony, they would cover their face, and that would be men. And as I looked at all the rich symbolism in various cultures, I found that a lot of times what is veiled is actually the thing that is seen as kind of the holy of holies that you only can unveil in certain circumstances. So in a way, what I came to see, and I'm not saying that my interpretation was correct, I'm only giving this as an example of the complexity of ritual symbols, is that I said that in a way you can see the veiled woman as the heavenly mother who needs to be unveiled. That's one meaning. I have a bunch of others in that article. But then at the end of the article, after I've talked about how rich and wonderful this symbol is and what it can be, I finally come to the conclusion where I say, in spite of the fact that I would hate to lose this symbol because I think it has so much richness to it, it is going to be used to subordinate women and to silence them. Then I want to rend the veil and tear it in two and write upon it a title of liberty for all Mormon women. And that sort of tension expresses feelings about a lot of things, like, separating men and women in the temple, that I think in a ritual level, these things can have some really important meanings that are not just simply, women are not as good as men. But unfortunately, we're not trained to think about symbols, and so they just become a mechanism for reinforcing, these really bad patterns within the organization. And so when I wrote that article, it was sort of almost this mourning or grief that, it's almost like we have to lose good things sometimes because they're used for negative purposes. And so this goes back to the statement when I said that my daughter said we go from naive belief to naive disbelief. I think the same thing. It's sort of like we often in the church, it's like, either it's all true or it's all false. And I think most things as a mixture, and not just a mixture in the sense of truth and falsehood, but a mixture in the sense that you can take good things and use them to support bad principles. But on the other hand, there are things I would change in the temple. So I would actually want to leave the veil. I would want to keep men in. I like this sort of idea of the ritual purity and the separation of the sexes and then joining up and all of that. But the two big things I would change that I think are the most damaging to women in the temple are the fact that the God images are all male. I would probably put a whole council of gods with half female. So I would have the Elohim be a council of gods, half women and half men.
Yeah, I like that.
And I would, eliminate the thing of women being priestesses to their husbands. I think that is just, because that's central in Mormon ritual, I think you have to get rid of that. And I think there's historical precedents and theological precedents. So now I'll go back to the 5 points of fellowship, because that's related. So do any of you even know about the 5 points of fellowship?
I've heard about it, but remind me.
They removed it a long time ago. And again, it's been a long time since I've been to the temple. But in the temple ritual, when you got to the very end, when you were approaching the veil, And symbolically, it's supposed to be, I think, Jesus that you're embracing through the veil. I mean, the Book of Mormon. The Lord is the keeper of the gate, and He employs no servant there. And the idea is you go up to the veil, and the 5 points of fellowship were that there was a ritual embrace where you do knee to knee, shoulder to shoulder, and have hands on the back. So you're touching the other person in 5 places. And so it's like knee to knee, foot to foot, shoulder, and then hand on the back.
Okay.
And to me, it was a symbol also of embracing Jesus through His wounds. It's almost like the way that I interpreted it was that it's like He fills you to see if you have been wounded like He was wounded. And so you also have the patriarchal grip, and so He's feeling your hand to see if you have been wounded with Him. Mm-hmm. This was my interpretation. Paul and I probably worked this out together. And to me, it was a very beautiful symbol. And I mean, the richness of this symbolic embrace, but it was, enacted. I loved it. But they eliminated it because I think there were a lot of complaints that so they were being groped by the male temple workers. Interesting, huh?
That's so. I'm just trying to wrap my head around that. It's like
roped. You can probably have it removed. Maybe they should do that about the veil, right? But but on the other hand, so I'm saying, well, I don't want women being groped inappropriately at the veil. But on the other hand, it's so sad to lose that really rich symbol.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That for me is an illustration of what I'm talking about. But I agree with what you were saying. It was you, Glenn, who said, a ritual is extremely important because it does express central theological ideas. So again, I already said what I would see as the 2 main changes that I think you have to have in this important ritual to make women, equal of value to men and equal authority. I would first change I would definitely start with the temple because I think it's so central. But I also actually would immediately ordain women to the, I would immediately ordain women and insist that there were women on all the priesthood councils, including making women apostles.
Right. Which ironically wouldn't change the temple ceremony too much, right? Because interestingly enough, by ordaining women, there wouldn't have to be, other than the changes you just stated about the temple, it's not like women having priesthood would change the temple ceremony all that much because they already have it there. So it's not as, it's just interesting that it's not as big of a deal in that context, even though it's a huge deal outside of the temple.
Yeah. So although I believe very much that the temple ceremony endows women with priesthood, but if you're making them eternally subordinate to their husbands,
oh, absolutely,
that is very damaging. So that's why I would do that. But I agree with you. And of course, it's really interesting in the church that you have set up, talking about separate systems, 2 systems for acquiring priesthood. I think the temple ceremony endows people with priesthood. And when I look at, historically and theologically what Joseph Smith did, I think he intended the temple ceremony to be a bestowal of, to give people the fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood. And in fact, when I read the statements of Joseph Smith, I think he believed that the temple gave any man or woman who had it the keys of the priesthood that gave them a lot of autonomy. But he also set up this church system with this authoritative system. So it's like almost 2 contradictory systems.
Right.
So, and that's sort of an ongoing tension and problem that I think you have inherent in Mormonism too, with the notion of like free agency and that, you should be, that each person should, ask God themselves, like in the first vision, that you have to get your own knowledge and your own testimony, and yet we have this whole subordination to authority, which I think is just ruining the church on every level. The authoritarianism is really destructive. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting that now those two things, the temple and the church, in terms of priesthood, are seen, can be seen as kind of contradictory in terms of women. So you have some women who say, I have priesthood in the temple and I don't need it in the church. And I have never seen it like that. For me, the priesthood in the temple actually gives you authority that you should be able to act in the church too. And in fact, theologically, I feel that when Joseph Smith turned the keys over to women in Nauvoo, when he said, I turn the keys to you, I think basically he was giving women the power to ordain each other. Yeah, I think he did. But, the church doesn't acknowledge that. So a lot of priesthood power is about when you have a system, you can claim that you have all this power from God, but if you're not acknowledged within the system, you can't really function within that organization, which for me is why it's essential that women are ordained to all of the ecclesiastical offices. So this will be a good time for me to kind of to answer that question about, do I believe in a separate priesthood for women? Now,
Right.
I can understand why reading some of the things I've written that people would think I believe that, but I actually don't. I do not think that women have a separate priesthood, a different kind of priesthood than men do, nor do I think they should. So I do not believe that there should be like a female priesthood and a male priesthood.
Right.
But
It's a priesthood. It's not a restroom.
yeah, exactly. And as far as that goes, in the house, men and women both use the same restroom, right? So,
Good point.
yeah, exactly. But so, yeah, and so theologically, there are two reasons why, I don't believe in this, male priesthood and female priesthood. And again, I can see why people could think that. But one of the problems I see is that I think we've failed to sort of deal with the complexity of how priesthood works. We want it to be a very, very simple, linear thing in the church. And I've tried to argue for seeing it more complexly. So I want to first of all just say two things of why I don't believe in two separate priesthoods. And then I want to say why I think we need to think about it more complexly. So it's not just, if we ordain women, everything will be fine. And, so on the one hand, I was was very much in favor of ordaining women. And in terms of activist things, you have to have this kind of simple goal, and ordaining women would be a great thing. But I think that, if we go back to the fantasy of I had a chance to kind of have some influence on what happens in the church, I would want us to think more complexly about what priesthood does. Yeah, so to start with, my two reasons why I don't see the priesthood as like two separate priesthoods. First, and one is a spiritual thing and the other is ecclesiastical. So on a spiritual level, if we talk about priesthood having at least two different manifestations, and the Doctrine and Covenants talks about this, that priesthood is the power of God. And for me, that connects with the Spirit of God that is you can see as light and life and truth and beauty that fills the immensity of space. And that power, I think, is available to everybody. And it's personal and it's charismatic and it's connected to personal gifts and talents. And that's talked about in section 121. So to me, that's not gender. It's really essential to see priesthood as that spiritual power that really cannot be controlled by an institution. They can try, but it's kind of like the scriptures define the Spirit. It blows where it wants, and people can receive it and use it. So there's that, which is priesthood power that's not gendered. And also is really essential, I think, if you're going to have a healthy community. You can't see priesthood simply as office. And one of the problems in the church is that leaders assume that if you have office, you also have competence and knowledge and spirituality, and none of that necessarily goes together.
Right.
You can have office and be, just a horrible person who has no spirituality. That's one reason why, I don't see, it's not like men and women have a separate priesthood. This power is the same. The second reason is that, and this has to do with the problem with separate but equal, right? Mm-hmm. it never works. And so I see, and actually from the very first talk I gave at Sunstone, which was in 1984, my missing rib paper, I said in that paper, the church will never be right until women are included in all the priesthood councils of the church, from the Quorum of the 12 on down. And I've always been committed to that in terms of ecclesiastical governing councils, we have to have men and women, and I would argue for transgendered or other people, right, that it should be inclusive. You need women on all of those ecclesiastical councils. So those are my two reasons for saying it's not a separate priesthood. The power is the same, and women need to interact with men in all the councils. So then my complications. One of my problems with just, okay, let's ordain women and everything will be okay, is that it's not just the temple, but this goes back to the beginning of our discussion, Bob, where, the whole idea of the scriptures, they're so male.
Yeah.
And you just simply include women in the priesthood structure. There are no female models that give women. I think women need a female genealogy, if I can use that word, and I'm kind of using it in the academic sense, a female genealogy, kind of thinking of Foucault, a female genealogy of female power that has female names. Because if you think about Mormon, it's not just like priesthood. If we just had priesthood, but priesthood has been so not just male-identified because it has men, but you think about it, Aaronic priesthood, Melchizedek priesthood, Abrahamic priesthood, patriarchal priesthood, the temple again, Jehovah, Michael, Elohim, everything. It's so male, and the scriptures are so male. And so I think where people have thought that I'm trying to do a separate priesthood is I'm saying, well, we need female names. We need female figures. We need, I want a Miriamic priesthood. I want girls to have a Miriamic priest. They could have this figure of Miriam, the sister of Moses, right? She is their model. So I just feel like naming is so important, and that these models, and which is also why I feel like you have to have the Heavenly Mother in the temple. You've got to have a female goddess in the temple. You can't just leave it male and say, oh, we'll just include women.
But then how do you fill the backstory? Where do you go for source material? And I'm not saying this is a reason not to do it. I'm just saying once you've done it, you've done this naming convention.
I can answer that for you really easily, Bob.
Oh, okay.
We believe everything that has been revealed, everything that is revealed, and that there will be revealed a great many things, and including Scripture. So you've got the Book of Abraham that, revealed new things. And there's supposedly a book of Joseph out there.
Well, in the Book of Abraham, even if you don't believe historical, the whole idea of the Council of Gods, the Book of Abraham is the model for that.
Right.
And actually that one also, in terms of the language, much clearer than Genesis, in the whole notion that humans are created male and female like the gods. Because you can interpret Genesis to mean a sort of androgynous, beyond gender God.
Yeah.
The Book of Abraham kind of makes it this male and female. And I think women, you need to see embodiment. I mean, we're a very embodied religion, and I think you need to see embodiment with female names and figures that give women, again, this genealogy of female power that they don't have. And that if you just push them into the male system, they won't get.
Totally get that. That makes a lot of sense. I don't mean to get stuck on the logistics, but how do you not fall prey to the issues the Book of Abraham has, with its historicity and all this stuff? Would you just go the inspired fiction route, or would these revelations really, come across as a historical record of women in the same way Joseph intended previous things he did from way back when? I mean, we're in fantasy land asking our leadership to do this in the first place, but assuming that they could, how would they do it? Yeah.
Well, I mean, for my doctoral dissertation, I worked on medieval women mystics. And it's kind of interesting that if you look at the history of Catholicism, they have all kinds of things that they add in terms of female figures. I mean, some of them come just from visionary things, and then, someone says it, and then people accept it, and maybe it does start with inspired fiction, but then it becomes mythic in the best sense of that word. But I think there's something to build on. I mean, if you think about the figure of Sarah, or some of the Old Testament women, again, I mean, it's the whole notion of midrash too, where I don't know if you know that whole tradition in Judaism where you sort of do make up inspired stories, but you start from a point that is accepted as a sacred text.
Interesting.
And that happened in Catholicism a lot too. Even if you look at the figure of Mary, I mean, I think Mary, the Book of Mormon talks about Mary as being this sort of, I think, divine figure. And of course, I've always seen Eve as if you think about, Elohim, Jehovah, and Michael as the sort of in the temple trinity, and then if you had a female, ones to match. Or in one article where I think people could have thought I was arguing for a separate priesthood, I say, well, you have Peter, James, and John in the temple. Why not have Mary and Martha? And, so there's something we could build on, right? That there's something. And
I like it.
You hope that somehow it catches on and that there's something for women. I wrote one piece where I talked about Chieko Okasaki being a prophetess. It's true. They're really far between, but you've got to start somewhere and start building, I think.
Yeah, and I just wish the church would even be like 1% in the direction of something like that happening. I just don't know, and I don't mean to bring us out of fantasy because it's fun, but can the church, can modern revelation be held up to the 21st century scrutiny that would follow? I mean, how could we do it today in a way that would be legitimate but not legitimate's a weird word, but do you know what I mean? Like, it's just that even Mormonism gets scrutinized so much because it's such a young religion and you can verify so much stuff. So I think in this new paradigm of modern revelation to reveal this, it'd have to be done in a way with a mechanism that didn't allow for, poking of holes so much, because it just, in the 21st century, modern revelation is dead, really, because we haven't heard anything over the pulpit for so long. So we'd have to. I just don't know how the brethren would go about it, but not to say that I don't want it to happen. The way they are right
now, there's no way that they will go around about anything like this.
Right.
I mean, partly you have to get away from the idea, though, of the sort of literal, that everything we believe is literal, right?
Right.
Rather than, to me, in my believing moments, again, I kind of go back and forth between believing and not believing. But by believing, and here's another problem I have, people always think, if you say I believe, they think you're saying you're a true believing Mormon, which I am not in any sense of the word.
Right.
But I have hope that there is a spiritual realm. But I also know that if there is a spiritual realm, I see it through a glass darkly, as Paul said in the New Testament, and that the only access we have, if there is another realm, we see it through symbols, and it is mythic, and mythic not in the sense of a false story, but mythic in the sense of trying to get to spiritual truths that we don't understand. Even if you believe there's a spiritual realm, the myths about the spiritual realm are not literal descriptions necessarily, but some mechanism, just like ritual is. Ritual and myths, they can just be about psychological truths and about community truths if you're more secular. But if you're spiritual, they're conduits into another realm, but we don't see that realm clearly. And that's where you get into the goofy if you try to think it's too literal. You have to sort of, that's, to me, faith is not, the sort of naive, just, I believe it's all true because I was told it was. But it's the idea of, to me, it's almost a playfulness where a hope that there might be something in another realm, and that I'm willing to use stories to try to access these deeper realms. And maybe it's just psychological truth. But for me, myth leads you to a truth about the self that even if we don't live on after this life, myths and rituals are the only mechanism for finding that deep psychological self-revelation. I see as a big obstacle is our obsession about the literal historicity. I mean, because you have the same problem with Jesus. I mean, who knows, right?
Right. God
figures, mythic figures. Because really, if you look at, Peter, James, and John, or, the Aaronic and the Melchizedek, those are really, Mormons hate that term mythic. But if you're thinking of myth in this larger sense, those are mythic figures. That's their function.
And so our heroine withdraws to the tiger.
So that does it for our discussion with Margaret. Obviously, there was more to say, but this was where the audio completely dropped out. Now, Margaret did agree to come on at another time for another discussion, so if there's anything more that you want to hear from her, let us know on our website. And, as I was listening back to this, especially this last part where Bob is wondering how on earth the Mormon Church could possibly create new scripture to provide this genealogy that Margaret was talking about and, provide some doctrinal legitimacy for a more expanded female role. As I was listening to this conversation, I couldn't help but think of this other conversation that we're going to have in a couple of weeks. The idea about belief being a choice or not. Because the way it sounded to me, obviously, if new scripture like the Book of Abraham were introduced into the church today, it would undergo tremendous scrutiny. And to the Bobs of the world, it would, like the Book of Abraham, most likely fail to measure up to whatever it was claiming to be, historically at least. But to the Margarets of the world, or at least to those willing to look at new scripture through non-literal, mythic, metaphoric eyes, perhaps it could provide some doctrinal foundation for a new expanded female role. And if that was the case, could this subset of people who are intentionally ignoring the historical problems and are instead intentionally taking an approach that makes it far more acceptable to them, isn't that subset essentially making a conscious choice that allows them to believe? I don't know. But I find this question of belief and choice very interesting. And like I said, we'll be tackling it in a couple of weeks. Until then, thanks for tuning in. And if you considered sending us a listener outro, we could use some more. So go to our website, look under the Contacts tab. It gives you instruction. We'd love to have you close out our podcast. So send it to us. We'll use it. And are we having fun yet?
Are we having fun yet?
Hi, this is Todd from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I love driving to work because I listen to Infants on Thrones on my commute. You can comment on this episode on the website, infantsonthrones.com, and if you really like what you hear, give the Quorum a 5-star rating and write a short review on iTunes. I did. Anyone for the closing prayer?
Thank you for listening to Infants on Thrones.